It's finally over. I finished watching Better Call Saul. I have completed season 6, and guys, my heart is absolutely shattered. Today, we are going to be talking about Better Call Saul season 6. I'm going to go through the entire thing. I'm going to recap the story, talk about what I liked, how I was feeling at particular moments. If you've watched the channel before, you know how the videos are done here, guys. We're going to talk about that in just a second. And of course, if you haven't figured it out, there are going to be spoilers. We're going to get into that in just a second. Before we do, though, I do want to say hello, everybody, and welcome back to another video. If you are new here, my name is Kyle. I'm your guy with too many YouTube channels. Let's talk about this heartbreaking show. Like, oh my god. Okay, I'll just start from the beginning, okay? It starts off, and I was a little bit confused with a couple scenes here, but of course, ever since Better Call Saul was over, I was excited to watch all these video essays on it. I was excited to watch, like, you know how I always talk about, I like watching the Sean Chandler type channels where they just talk about a story, kind of like what I'm doing here. Of course, Sean Chandler being the inspiration for my YouTube channel here, but there's a lot of different YouTubers that I've been watching. So I had the answers to a lot of my questions that I have been having here, including something that I have been wondering, which is, what is going on with Kim? I don't understand why she's down for this, but not down for that. She does stuff and then feels bad for herself, but we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about all this as we continue on throughout the story. So starts off with a flash forward, and the reason why I mentioned that is because this flash forward had me incredibly confused because it showed Saul living in a mansion, and I didn't understand that that was a flash forward. I should have thought about it. Maybe at the time I was thinking like this could be a flash forward, but the entire thing honestly kind of just left me really confused because Saul was living in a mansion, he was sleeping with a stripper, he was waking up and being Saul Goodman right away, which I later found out that is a persona that he puts on. Like, I knew that Saul Goodman was a persona, but I didn't know that he used that to mask his horrible depression. Like, holy. This show just puts a whole new spin on Jimmy McGill, which is absolutely crazy. So they're moving everything out of his mansion, right? Or no, they're taking, sorry, the flash forward was people taking stuff out of Saul's mansion after Saul went into hiding, because that was a different flash forward that we looked in. Apologies for that. So my point being, this entire thing kind of confused me. So Saul was living in a mansion, and he ended up dropping Kim's bottle stopper, and that's where I was really confused also, because I was looking at it, it was like, huh, okay, that means something, but then it turned out to be Kim's bottle stopper, of course, right? So that entire thing confused me at the time, but now I completely understand it and brings a whole new meaning to it. So, getting into the actual season, getting to the present, Nacho goes into hiding as Gus directed because the cartel thinks and kind of knows that Nacho helped in Lalo's death, and it was an entire thing there. So Nacho, we have that whole plot point of Nacho running and hiding from people, and he's unsure who's on his side. And Nacho, I still didn't know what to think of Nacho, but I do want to talk about Nacho more so when we get towards, like, you know, the big end of Nacho, right? So Jimmy and Kim, that last season, they ended off the last season talking about how they could actually ruin Howard's career, because that was a big thing. They were making out and like getting off on the entire idea of ruining Howard, right? So that was a big thing in itself. So the plan actually started to commence here. Howard was at a golf match in like that weird club. Jimmy ends up sneaking the, I don't even know what he ended up using. I don't even know, it could have been sugar, but he ended up putting cocaine into Howard's locker for Cliff to find, and little did we know it was going to work out, of course, because Cliff was like, what the heck? And of course, Howard didn't think of anything at first. He was just kind of looking at it like, huh, what could this be? What could this possibly be, right? But we then move on to Lalo, who is alive and well, as we know, but the people in the show don't exactly know. Lalo goes on, and there were some people that I guess he was kind of housing, but it turns out he killed some chick with some scissors, and some guy he ended up matching his dental records with and wanted to get his facial hair to like look like him. They were being super nice. They're like, Lalo, thank you so much for everything. And Lalo just ended up killing him, but he wanted to use the guy's body as his own body, so everybody starts believing in Lalo's death. Now, Lalo ended up wanting to kill Gus, but he ended up talking to Hector on the phone, and instead, Hector did tell Lalo that he needed evidence. So Lalo, instead, a little bit later, ends up going to Germany because he's not just going to go out and go for Gus, and that's a big thing. That's what's something we didn't know at the time, that Lalo was going to head to Germany. So we were left this entire time thinking like, where is Lalo? Why isn't he going after Gus? And you could see Gus, which was very interesting because Gus was having a little bit of an internal freak out. Usually Gus is so like, he plans everything. He's like, cool, no expression to him, but he's like this all the time. He's like, Lalo Salamanca is alive. Between all of this happening, though, Mike and the gang end up going to Nacho's place and replace Nacho's safe, and Mike, being the solid guy that he is, or depending on how you look at the entire situation, he does end up taking the passport or the fake ID, whatever it was, for Nacho to have his dad go to Canada. Point is, he didn't want anybody to find Nacho's dad, right? So after that, Hector and Gus ended up meeting, and Gus was convinced by Hector's demeanor, because they had this whole meeting about like Lalo being alive, right? But Hector was like smiling, shaking his hand. Hector was just like not being Hector at all by his demeanor, and after Gus being around him for so long, Gus was fully convinced that Lalo was still alive, and Hector ended up knowing something. So that's when really Gus started kind of freaking out inside, and he's like, he's alive, like he's coming for me, because he knows what an absolute killer that Lalo is. So Hector, to be honest with you, kind of gave it away, and oh boy, this whole thing gets so insane, right? This is only the beginning of the season too. There's so much that I cannot wait to talk about. So after that, the cousins end up going to capture Nacho, which ends up leading to a crazy shootout. And because Nacho isn't in Breaking Bad, I was sitting here and thinking like, okay, Nacho's not going to make this out alive. Nacho is going to die somehow. I didn't think he was going to have a happy ending. I didn't think he was going to run away with his father. To be honest with you, I thought both him and his father was going to die, because if you take a look at the way everybody ended up in Breaking Bad, right, and Better Call Saul, with him not being in the show, I thought he was a goner. I thought his dad was a goner. So I was sitting here going, the cousins are such ruthless killers. They are going to get Nacho. But at that time, I wasn't thinking that they wanted Lalo alive. But even if I thought Nacho was going, did I say Lalo? I meant to say Nacho. Even if I was sitting here in like, oh no, Nacho's going to die. And I'm really conflicted. And this is where I'll talk about it, because I'm conflicted on how I feel about Nacho, because I've spoken about this in my other season recaps if you guys have watched it. I have really no respect for a guy like Nacho who's getting into such bad business, hurting people, doing all this bad stuff, right? But we get hints and clues throughout the entire thing that Nacho was kind of, he didn't want this, but we didn't know how he got into it. So if he got into this willingly, wanted to hurt people, but what if he was forced into it by the families, If that's the case, then I really like Nacho. But if he's willingly doing all this, willingly being a criminal, willingly hurting people, then I don't feel bad for him, and I wouldn't care if he suffered. But not knowing this, I can't help but cheer for and root for Nacho, especially like the dude, like he's a good character, man. He's a fantastic character, and I feel bad for everything that he ended up going through, because, man, the guy just, he wanted to run away with his dad, and his dad wasn't having it. So he was forced to stay here, and he's forced to comply with everything just to protect his father. But then again, on the other side of the table, he was kind of forced to work here. He wanted to run away, but he was forced to for the protection of his father. So I found myself, regardless, during the show happening, cheering for Nacho. You get what I mean here? It's really, really tough, right? So Nacho ended up escaping the shootout, and I was like, I didn't know what to think there, because I was like, Nacho's gotta die. Nacho's gotta die. And I was feeling the same way about Kim. We're going to talk about that. Oh boy. So in between all of this, Gus ended up ordering for Nacho's father to be used as a bribe, but then Mike put a stop to it. That's where Mike and Gus ended up having a little bit of a, not a firefight, but like a huge conflict, because Mike was like, we are not going to do that. His father's a good man, and Mike having a soft spot for him. Mike doesn't want anybody who's not involved in the business to get hurt. And we didn't really get to see where that would have went, because that scene ended with Nacho calling, and Mike kind of held up the phone and was like, there he is. And then we stopped there, right? And I believe we go into a flash forward. I have my points on my screen here. Anyways, in between that, Jimmy ends up meeting with the Kettlemans to end up starting the entire like framing Howard type thing. And that was to be honest with you, there's not too much important to say there. It was funny to see the Kettlemans again. The plan worked. I could kind of see what Jimmy was trying to do, trying to get them to go to Howard, talk about the drug use and all of that, right? So to be honest with you, there's not much else to talk about that besides like the plan is happening. We're happening, right? So after that, we're brought back to Nacho. Nacho is still hiding from the cousins. He ends up hiding the oil, and I was still sitting here. And please let me know down below if you were thinking the same thing I was, because every single time I saw Nacho running, hiding in a shootout in this like particular like scene, right? I kept thinking, okay, cousins are gonna find him. Nacho's dead. Because I was so convinced that he was gonna die, man. He died such a oof. I guess you could say like, a better way, if that's the way you want to put it. But anyways, so Nacho ends up actually escaping this moment, and he called his father. And this solidified me thinking that he was dying even more, because it was like this perfect goodbye thing. I was being brought back to Hank, right? When he had that final call with Marie, and he's like, Marie, I got him, baby. I love you, you know? And then Hank died shortly after, right? So really, really tough there. So I thought Nacho having this really, really heartbreaking scene with his dad really couldn't be bothered with the call. He doesn't know to what extent Nacho and himself are in trouble. So he's like, hey, Papa, I just wanted to hear your voice and everything. And he was really, really trying not to cry here. And then his dad was just, Nacho, we've been over this. Go to the police. And Nacho, knowing this could be it, that could be the last conversation he had with his father, had a little bit of a breakdown. I gotta say, in this scene, like, it really makes you feel it. He really, really makes you feel it. I will say, the two people that really stood out, especially in this final season, were the acting, and apologies, I don't know any of the actor names, Kim's actor and Nacho's actor. Honestly, I thought those two stood out this season as like, what brilliant performances. Like the entirety of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, the casting job was done perfectly, but when it came time to really feel for somebody, nobody did it better than Kim and Nacho. I believe they just stood out. So please let me know down below if you actually agree with that. After that, we're brought back to, speaking of which, Kim, and the prosecutor ends up trying to have a little bit of a talk with Kim because they figured out about Lalo's true identity. And she was kind of like, yo, did Jimmy know about this? Is he dragged into it? And she was kind of trying to play like the good cop thing to Kim, right? And Kim, this is where we really start to see her sink her feet in and kind of become the bad guy. Either that or she was just kind of protecting Jimmy and didn't trust anybody, right? But this is where Kim really, really embraces like, okay, I'm with Saul. I'm this type of person. And as we see her, she continues to make not so great choices down the road, right? So other than that, nothing really came from it where she's like, oh, we had no idea. We had no idea, but they had their suspicions of Jimmy, right? So that's an entire process in itself, right? Kim and Jimmy end up having another scene after that where they get a duplicate of Howard's keys, which is a little bit of a fun thing, but I didn't know, and this is what's fun about it, what they did throughout the entire thing, right? We didn't know what they were going to do with the keys. We didn't know what the plan was, so we're kind of finding out in real time. That's really what I love about Breaking Bad, because we know that they're going to try and frame Howard as a drug addict, but we don't know what they're going to do with the keys, what Jimmy is doing dressed like him and stuff like that, right? We're watching it and we're figuring out, right? So that's a really, really cool part about it. We are then brought back to Nacho meeting with Gus. We are then brought back to the phone call. Gus arranges for Nacho to be brought back, right? And they decide that Nacho is going to die and take the blame for everything and tell Gus's story as long as his father's safe. And Mike, being the solid guy that he is, guaranteed that nothing will happen to his father. And Nacho and Mike having that respect for each other, Nacho agreed to do it. And there was this really, really heartbreaking scene, right, where nobody cared about Nacho. Nobody liked Nacho, right? I think it was Tyrus that he's like, okay, you're too pretty. We got to make you a little bit more ugly. And he was going to beat him up. And Mike was like, I'll do it. So they have a shot together. And then Mike ends up actually having to be the guy to beat up Nacho, which is really, really horrible. So then I was sitting here and I'm thinking, this is for God knows what reason I had my doubts. God knows what reason I had my doubts. Because this entire time, I'm like, Nacho's gone. Nacho's dead. Nacho's dead. Nacho's dead. Nacho's dead. Now we're here and I'm like, is this all going to go according to plan? Because knowing Better Call Saul, knowing Breaking Bad, the plan doesn't always just go how the plan was supposed to go. But this time, it more or not so did go, right? So they all end up being met in the desert. And Nacho actually has, in my opinion, the big Ozymandias type moment. He has the speech, right? He has the I watched Jane die moment. That's what really hit me. Like, I thought this was like an Ozymandias type thing. He's out in the desert. And again, the actor for Nacho, brilliant. Like, this dude is so good at what he does. Really made you feel it. He admits to everything. He tells Gus's story, but at the same time, admits to putting Hector in the wheelchair. Oh, man, like, that was such a good scene. Then Nacho ends up admitting to everything, taking a gun, blowing his own head off. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, that's how Nacho goes? I didn't think he was actually going to die there because I'm used to everything just like, but that's the brilliant storytelling, right? I'm so used to something happening that's not supposed to be happening that the thing that was supposed to happen shocks me. Amazing scene. Absolutely amazing. And I was all up in my feelings because I really like Nacho. But then I was taken out of my feelings. I was taken right out of my feelings because the cousins carry Hector. And in the background of the scene, Hector just starts blowing him up, like having the gun. He's like, I didn't get to kill him. Like, so he's sitting there with a wheelchair, like, right? Like, I don't know why. Like, I hope to God somebody else found that funny because, oh my God. I was completely taken out of the feeling from Nacho's death. Like, to be honest, the Breaking Bad has like such underrated humor, but was that supposed to be funny? Like, am I just an idiot for laughing at it? I don't even know, right? So, after that, Kim ends up meeting with Cliff, and we see the entire plan happen. We see Jimmy dressed as Howard. We have that whole fun thing with the parking spot, right? Who parks? Who moves a cone and parks there? Like, lots of people, right? So he takes the car. We get to see Wendy. So Hank's best friend, Wendy. Saul picks her up, and then you have that whole thing where Kim and Cliff are meeting up, and Saul's driving as Howard, supposedly, with the car. Cliff sees it, and Kim's like, oh, I don't know. It all happened so fast. He kicks her out of the car, and he's like, you a-hole, and starts freaking out on Wendy. Put on a great performance there, right? And then Jimmy puts the car back, barely gets away with it, right? But he gets away with it, and then Cliff finally has his suspicions. It all worked. And of course, Kim's playing very, very stupid, right? But then, after that scene, Jimmy ends up going back to work and finds out that everybody is shunning him. Everybody hates him for helping Lalo. And then that other lawyer, the name is always escaping me for some reason. That other lawyer was saying to him in the stairwell, like, there's proving and then there's knowing, and everybody knows what you are, Jimmy. So that was a whole thing in itself, and nothing actually really came from it, to be honest. You just ruined some relationships, but that's Saul Goodman for you, right? Kim ends up noticing that she's being followed and talks to those guys, and I thought, to be honest with you, I didn't know what to think. I thought it was Lalo's guys, but it ended up being Mike's guys because Mike then confronted Kim that Lalo's still alive, and he's like, you won't be able to see these guys, don't worry about it, we're just in the 1,000,000 to 1 chance that Lalo appears to somebody that he's talking to, we want to have guys there for your protection. So Kim starts freaking out on side, and Kim doesn't tell Jimmy. After everything that they've gone through, Kim, this is where Kim starts to become like the Saul Goodman type character, right? Which is very, very interesting, right? After that, Kim is, of course, all up in her feelings. She's all upset, and she's worried, she's anxious. I'm not saying that she doesn't, excuse me, my phone's going off here. She's all up in her feelings, and she's really, really anxious that Lalo might come back. So she doesn't really care when Jimmy gets his new office. And Jimmy, you could tell he's like a little bit hurt, and she's like, oh, what do you think about this? It's temporary. And she's like, yep. Sounds good. Sounds good. That's yeah. I don't mind it. So Jimmy gets a new office. He hires Francesca back, and Francesca ends up, this is a little bit out of order probably, but Francesca ends up making this beautiful, beautiful work that Kim likes to see, right? So after that, Howard ends up being confronted by Cliff about the drug use, and Cliff is going to Howard as a friend, and Howard's like, cocaine? What are you talking about, Howard? I saw you. It was your car. I dealt with this with my own son, and Cliff was actually coming to him as a friend. And this is where the craziness starts, because Howard was like, I don't have a drug problem. I have a Jimmy McGill problem, and takes off, right? He then arranges for Jimmy to have a boxing match with him, which was a really weird scene, to be honest with you. But the whole point was to get Howard's guy to end up following Jimmy, which ended up being Jimmy's actual guy. After all of this, we are then brought back to Lalo. We finally figured out where Lalo is, and he actually went to Germany. He went to Germany to track down Werner's wife and starts flirting with her. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, oh boy, he's going to figure out all the information, he's going to kill her, because he ends up breaking into her house, but he ends up getting away with it scot-free, right? Everything's okay. So, speaking of Lalo, which I shouldn't have said that, not speaking of Lalo, Lalo's scene does end there. Excuse me, I don't know why I said that. We then go back to Howard's guy, and Howard ends up, Howard's guy, which is working for Jimmy, so Jimmy's guy, we'll call him Howard's guy, right? The guy investigating Jimmy, or pretending to investigate Jimmy, you get the point that I'm trying to put here. He brings back to Howard that Jimmy took out a big cash withdrawal. So Howard's like, yes, I got Jimmy. There's a big problem here. Something's going on. I'm going to expose Jimmy. And then we have this whole situation where Cliff ends up inviting Kim to Santa Fe because she has an opportunity and she's going to get recommended to have her own law practice by herself like she's always wanted. And Jimmy, of course, suggests that she goes and do it. But then after a whole photo shoot, because Jimmy ends up trying to be I guess he was a judge. I'm pretty sure he was a judge. He ends up making a whole fake thing about the judge, right? To further get into the Howard thing. Kim ends up, after Jimmy sees and that dude has a broken arm, they need to reshoot everything that they've done. Kim does the Saul Goodman type thing again and decides against going to Santa Fe and just completely abandons the entire meeting to help Jimmy with a scheme, because this is where I was really confused, because we find out later that Kim is just like Jimmy and ends up getting off to all this type stuff, right? She's just like this. She likes the excitement. We had some flashbacks on Kim as a child, right? So Kim ends up still doing the Saul Goodman type thing and wants to just completely support Jimmy and completely get into the scheme because that's where she finds exciting. In between these scenes, though, we end up having Lalo find more information and finding that guy in the forest, the one guy that was working with Werner, and he gets a little bit more information, ends up killing him. A whole scene there. I thought that Lalo ended up getting hurt there, but it didn't really seem to make too much of a difference, right? While Lalo's doing that, Jimmy and Kim end up reshooting their photos, and then the entire Howard plan actually takes place. Here's the big thing. I don't know why, but there was this scene where Jimmy ended up finding that guy with the black book, which is very nice tie into Breaking Bad. That's how we find out that Jimmy ends up having all of the contacts that he does, is because he gets that contact book from that guy who's retiring. But it was also that guy who ends up giving the drug to Howard. I don't know why. I heard what they said and I was listening. I don't know if it was I was tired, because usually I watch Better Call Saul before bed, but I just didn't catch on to that's a drug. I thought Howard was going crazy in that place, but it all makes so much more sense now, because there's some stuff where it's like, oh, it feels like you're really high on coffee. You had a lot of coffee depending on your caffeine intake, you know? So I just missed that whole thing there. I wasn't thinking about it. I don't know. So Howard ends up getting the photos. He's all confident once he sits in the conference room for the Mesa Verde case, or was it Mesa Verde? The Sandpiper case, excuse me. They all sit together. The judge comes in, and Howard recognizes the judge because of Jimmy's scheme, and he's like, oh, no, oh, no. And then he starts calling for that chick to go get him photos, and it's just, those photos actually really made me laugh, because I have evidence that this guy is working for Jimmy McGill, and he starts sweating, eyes are going crazy. And when I was watching this, I thought that the whole situation was getting to Howard because he can't prove it, but he knows that Jimmy's behind all of this. I thought it was stress and anxiety getting to him, but they actually drugged him and made him seem crazier than he actually was, right? So that whole situation took place. He ended up embarrassing himself because the photos that they showed were just regular photos. And the judge was like, oh, is that supposed to be me? And of course, Howard actually ended up freaking out. The plan worked. And everybody thinks Howard's on drugs. Cliff is even more suspicious, which is insane. The situation gets more insane, though. The whole show gets more insane, because this might be the best episode of the show. It just might be, because everybody ends up finding that Lalo is alive, right? After after he called Hector and they had a wire on the phone or something. So Mike moves all of his men to protect Gus, right? But he takes them off Jimmy because they assume that he's not going to go Jimmy, right? Then we have this crazy thing where Howard, and I didn't expect this, to be honest with you. I didn't expect this. Howard ends up going to Jimmy and Kim's apartment, right? I expected that, but I didn't expect what happens after that to take place. He goes in there, starts freaking out, and he's really telling them what kind of sick people that they are. Why would you do this to me? I don't get it. What do you want, right? Here's your big celebration. Everything's okay. Lalo strolls in behind them. And then I was sitting there. I don't know if anybody else watching that expected this, but I was sitting there and I was like, oh boy. I didn't think Howard was going to die, though. If you were watching my other videos on Better Call Saul, I was convinced that Kim was a goner this whole time. I thought Kim was going to have some horribly tragic death because she is not mentioned. She's nowhere to be found in Breaking Bad. I thought Lalo was going to kill Kim. So this Howard death shocked me even more. I don't know about you guys. I didn't think that Howard was going to die like that. Lalo strolls in, hands in his pocket, totally chill. And Lalo's such a good actor, by the way, too. He's such a cool villain, man. Like, he's so, like, nonchalant about it. Strolls in. Howard's like, who the hell are you? Like, not knowing, of course, who you're talking to. Life lesson, by the way. You never know who you're talking to. And he's like, oh, I'm nobody. Just want to talk to my lawyers. And Howard goes, oh, yeah, here's some advice. Get better lawyers, right? And then Lalo, he starts screwing on the silencer to his gun. I'm like, I'm still sitting here. Honestly, I'm still sitting here going, Kim's a goner. Jimmy lied to him. Everything's crashing down. He's going to get revenge on Jimmy by killing the person that he loves. That's why I was so shocked when he killed Howard. Like, I know everybody was shocked about it, but I believe, like, honestly, I was more shocked than everybody else because I was expecting him to blow Kim's head off. Am I crazy for thinking that? And then she just shoots Howard, and the acting just, it's all amazing. Everything that happens there is amazing performance by everybody. Howard just falls, the blood spills, and Lalo is there, and I'm still thinking in that shock, Kim's next. Kim's next. He's going to kill Kim. Then he doesn't. He ends up wanting one of them to go kill Gus, which is honestly an amazing plan, right? And Jimmy, of course, negotiates for Kim to get out of there, which ends up working for Nacho because Jimmy's talking skills are very nice. So Kim has the task to go kill Gus. And in the meantime, Lalo ties up Jimmy, and Jimmy struggles and falls over and has to stare at Howard, his bleeding out head, while he can't move and he can't speak. And he's like, oh, you know, that must have been ridiculous. So Kim ends up, and it's the exact same thing, which is really cool. I love the way they tie everything to Breaking Bad. I know I don't mention everything here, but you remember in Breaking Bad when Walt was going to Gus's house to kill him and then just got a call from, I can't remember if he got a call from Mike or I believe it was Mike, either Mike or Gus, and just go home, Walter. I didn't really question it, but it makes so much sense now that we know because of the Lalo situation, we have people watching Gus's house. So that's how Gus knew that Walt was approaching Gus's house, which is crazy, right? I love that, man. I love that they tie everything together, and I could go into like detail about everything that's going on there. It's all really, really cool, right? I love what they did, man. So Kim ends up going there with the plan of killing Gus. It looked like she was going to go through it because if she killed Gus, Jimmy would be okay, but I didn't think Lalo was going to let them alive either way. But then they have a situation with Kim where Gus isn't there, and she ends up, Mike was like, what are you doing here? What are you supposed to be doing here? Where's Lalo? Lalo's at the apartment, right? And Kim just points to some brown guy and is like, I'm supposed to kill him. Because it's like, oh no. Right? And then they're all confused. So then they go back, everybody rushes to the apartment, right? But then Lalo kind of planned all of this. So Lalo is now on his own, sneaking into the laundry and actually finds Gus on his own. He actually finds Gus on his own, but Gus ended up placing a gun there earlier, which we didn't know about. And Lalo, being the sick guy that he is, starts videotaping everything. He starts videotaping everything for Hector, and he's really embarrassing Gus. And it is such a weird position to see Gus, by the way, because Gus is a little bit helpless. We know that he doesn't die because of Breaking Bad. We know how he gets out of it somehow, but it's like humiliating for Gus to see, right? It's so strange to be in Gus's position at that moment. So I knew something was going to happen. I thought somebody was going to come save him, but Gus ends up saving himself. The whole crazy thing happens where the lights get shut off, the power gets shut off, and Gus ends up shooting Lalo. Lalo dies with a smile on his face, right? And Gus ends up getting away, which is, that whole thing was crazy. That whole thing was absolutely insane. After that, we move on, and the show still continues, right? Because they need to clean up Howard's body. They need to clean up Lalo's body. And my friend texted me, by the way, or he didn't text me. We were talking about it regardless. I don't remember if it was a text or not, because apparently there was a joke when this came out that because they threw Howard's body and Gus and Lalo's body in the same hole. So throughout the entirety of Breaking Bad, they're cooking over Howard and Lalo's body. And I'm like, oh my God. That's crazy, right? So I didn't even think about that till my friend told me that, which is pretty funny. But we continue on with the show, right? They end up covering Howard's death. They make it a suicide. They drive the car out there, have the exact mileage and everything. Kim and Jimmy go to work. They have their normal day. They come home, and it's if none of that ever happened besides a new refrigerator. None of that, right? So they're dealing with the grief. They're dealing with the anxiety because they did not want Howard to die, right? They both feel really, really bad about it. And Gus ends up having a conversation with the cartel, and convinces them that he had no involvement in it, but the guy didn't really care because Gus makes him too much money. And he just had a talk with him after Hector pointed out, like, looking at his eyes, all you see is hate. And the guy was like, hate's okay, just not too much hate. Know your place. Then we're brought to another heartbreaking scene where Mike actually takes it upon himself to go visit Nacho's father and tell him what happened to Nacho, saying something along the lines of like, it was quick, painless, Nacho was a good man, he wasn't like the others. But the father just said something to the extent of, you gangsters are all the same. This isn't justice. And Mike, it was like, I'll get justice for this. We'll take care of the people who did this to Nacho, right? And the father didn't care. He just left Mike with a little bit of a hole in his heart, which was a really heartbreaking moment. So, because he was just sitting there like, my boy's dead, right? And he just completely blamed Mike for it. He blamed all of them for it. He didn't care that for the justice. He didn't care about anything. He wanted Nacho to go to the police, but he didn't understand that Nacho couldn't necessarily go to the police. Then we're taken to a memorial at HHM with Howard. And apparently this is where we learn, and this is where I like another tie into Breaking Bad, that we learn that HHM is downsizing. So that's why it's not necessarily present in Breaking Bad. They changed its name, right? So they end up talking to a couple people where it's like, oh my God, it's crazy. Howard was on drugs. Who knew? But then Jimmy and Kim end up having a conversation with Howard's wife and Cliff. And the wife blames Jimmy because she knows that Jimmy was messing with him. And he's like, well, I could have been a better friend to Howard, right? I could have been maybe everything was okay. You know, like I should have done this. I should have been there for him. But then Kim was actually the one that convinces him. Kim ends up scheming again, right? Because she makes up this entire fake story because we know that Howard, and we know that Jimmy and Kim know that Howard was sleeping in the guest house. So she's like, about a year ago, I saw Howard doing it in his office and we just locked eyes and I never said anything about it. And that kind of convinces her a little bit because it's not coming out of Jimmy's mouth. And then she asks Cliff, where it's like, have you seen anything where you could have seen this coming? And Kim was also like, well, you're his wife. Why would he want to tell you? Why would he want to tell you that, right? She ends up talking to Cliff, and Cliff doesn't, he's like, I don't know what to say, or something to the extent of that, or he locked eyes with her, right? Where the answer is, yes, I have seen Howard on drugs. So she actually believes the story and ends up crying in the bathroom, right? Because now she understands that this actually happened to Howard, right? After that, Kim starts feeling guilty, and this is where my heart broke a little bit because I actually really liked Kim and Jimmy. Kim relinquishes her law license, doesn't make up her mind, goes back to the apartment. Jimmy starts freaking out. He's like, you can't do this. You can't do this, right? We're going to fix this. We're going to talk about this, right? Jimmy ends up going to the bedroom before Kim ends up trying to tell him, because Kim was trying to tell him, but Jimmy kept interrupting her, that she was leaving him, that she was breaking up with him. And Jimmy, the actor, I think his name is Bob Odenkirk. I'm going to look so stupid if it's not. I'm so sorry. Jimmy ends up having a great performance here and starts saying, Kim, you make me happy. Don't do this, because he ran into all of her suitcases. And this is where Kim's acting shine too, because Kim, oh my God, she makes you feel it, man. And she's like, I'm having too much fun. I love you, but we hurt everybody around us, because the Howard guilt was really, really getting to her, right? She's leaving Jimmy. And at the time, I don't know if it was just how I felt about the story or if it was because I was all up in my feelings about it. I didn't like that this was Kim's ending, but I didn't know that this was going to be the ending, right? They're going to keep talking to each other after this. I thought that Kim was just going to leave the apartment that day, and then that's it for Kim, right? The story continues. I thought she was never going to see Saul again. And I was like, oh man, that's kind of a crappy way, because they just broke up and Kim's gone. That's all. I still thought Kim was like going to die somehow. So maybe it's because I was expecting too much from it. I kept expecting Kim to have this like grand death that let me down a little bit. But man, that whole breakup scene was horrible. Saul was looking at her. You make me happy. I don't know what to do without you. And it gets even worse because Jimmy ends up becoming Saul Goodman. But him becoming Saul Goodman is so much worse than Walter becoming Heisenberg. Because Walter actually turns into Heisenberg. Walter turns into this horrible person. Jimmy is this broken man. Jimmy is depressed, doesn't know what to do with himself, to mask the pain he puts on the Saul Goodman persona. While behind the mask, he's still Jimmy McGill. That is brilliant writing, and it makes me look at Breaking Bad an entirely different way. Because you see Saul as like the Saul Goodman guy, right? Saul Goodman. And he's like always knows what to do. He's this funny guy, right? But it's just a persona. He puts it on as he wakes up. He doesn't want to deal with regular life. He doesn't want to think about anything. That is so sad. It makes me have an entirely different outlook on Breaking Bad. I watched a little bit of a clip from the actor who plays Gus, and he said something to the extent of, if you were to watch Better Call Saul before Breaking Bad, you will have an entirely different experience watching Breaking Bad. I totally see that now. Jimmy is such a well-developed character, and we see the hurt that Saul Goodman is. I don't even know what I would think if this is the first time I was watching Breaking Bad, because I just looked at it like, hey, Saul's funny, Saul's cool, but Saul's hurting inside. Saul's completely hurting inside. So he ends up making the office a little bit tacky like we've seen in Breaking Bad. He ends up, the flashback that I spoke about at the beginning of the video, where he buys a mansion, he's sleeping with hookers, strippers, anything to distract him from regular life. He doesn't want to be alone. He doesn't want to be sad. He's Saul Goodman from the moment he wakes up to the moment he falls asleep. So that is absolutely insane. Crazy. Jimmy goes then to his office, and we're in Breaking Bad, which was crazy to me. We have a little bit more flashbacks to go through, but I didn't expect the rest of the series to be about Gene, which actually really surprised me. I liked what they did, don't get me wrong, but I kind of expected like the series to end with something like maybe he meets Walt and Jesse, right? So we end up having a flash forward to Gene in Omaha now, and this is where we finally figure out the entirety of what happens to Jimmy McGill, right? And I'm not going to lie, there's not exactly nearly as much to talk about as I've spoken about that with the first half of the season here, right? Well, it's not even the first half. I think it's like 4 episodes or something. So Jimmy ends up finding an old woman and ends up with the goal to confront her son because his son obviously recognized him as Better Call Saul. They end up having an entire heist, and Jimmy starts feeling good about the scene again. He starts feeling good about scheming because he hasn't done it so long. He's back in the game. He starts making some money, right? Which he starts becoming Saul again, right? He starts getting back into the business. And he was working all in some old lady's garage. He was doing it. Always like, hey, you having trouble with that car? He's so good at what he does, right? So good at what he does. So they end up having the entire scheme with the mall security officers. And to be honest with you, like, there's not too much to talk about that. They are successful with the scheme, except the part where the guy slipped and hit his head was really funny. I like that. And I was like, oh boy, this means Saul might get caught. Maybe he's going to get caught. But other than that, it all ended up working out. It was a really funny thing, right? So I'm not going to lie to you. There's not too much to talk about that. But the next episode ends up featuring a flashback to Breaking Bad, right? And I knew that something was coming because that was the episode title. It was Breaking Bad. So I was like, what's going to happen here, right? When Saul's in the desert. And then we get to see Walt and Jesse again, which is really cool. There's nothing too much that comes from that, though. It was kind of like a cameo thing, which it was like, oh my god, Walt and Jesse's here, right? And then we figure out how easy it actually was to find Walt because he just said, hey, what about the Walter White guy? What about Walter White? What about Heisenberg? Tell me about him. Well, Mike's just like, high school chemistry teacher. And then he gives all of his information, right? So then we have information on how Saul ends up finding Walt. And he's like, turns out you're pretty easy to find, right? So I love the little bit of a tie-in that they're doing there. It's really cool, right? We then get out of the flashback, right? And this is where Francesca and Jimmy have a call together. Francesca really hates him, but she ends up revealing that the FBI took all of his assets, and Kim actually mentioned him. And this is where I was sitting here, and I was like, okay, is Saul going to actually meet with Kim again? Is this not the end of Kim's story? I don't really know. And I don't remember at what point in the timeline we see Kim working, but regardless, they have the phone call. Jimmy starts catching up, but Francesca wants nothing to do with them, which just puts even more of a damper on Gene's life, to be honest with you, right? So Gene starts scheming again, ends up getting a little bit of a high from it, right? He ends up breaking into one guy's house after scheming so many people, right? We then take a pause there and are brought back to another flashback. And these flashbacks, there's so much to them, but there's so much meaning to them. There's so little to them, but there's so much meaning to them because most of the episodes are about Gene and what Gene's doing. But surprisingly, what's there to talk about is what's in the flashback. So flashback is Kim is meeting with Saul to finalize their divorce. And Jimmy is just completely in Saul Goodman. He's doing the exact same thing that happened with Chuck's death, where he's like, hey, Kim, have a nice life. And then looks at Francesca, hey, sweet cheeks, you know? So he's completely being so disrespectful to Kim. I get it, man. But what a piece of crap. Like, honestly, like, Kim has every right to leave him after everything. Kim has absolutely everything right to leave him. So Kim ends up leaving. she's all brokenhearted, right? She doesn't know what she just saw, right? Like, she's like, Saul doesn't care about me, or Jimmy doesn't care about me. She goes to have a cigarette, and then in the back, I knew it was Jesse. And then Jesse, in classic Jesse fashion, was just like, yo, this rain is bananas, yo. I don't know, like, it's just the way Jesse is that really makes me laugh, but it was really cool to see. So Jesse ends up going off on one of his rambles, which was really funny. He's like, hey, I was like, why do you even want that thing for? He ended up one of his buddies. I think it was not Combo. Crap, the name's not coming to me, but the guy in Breaking Bad, right? Kim was representing because Jesse recognized Kim, and he wanted to know if Saul was a good lawyer. And Kim ends up going out in the pouring rain saying, when I knew him, he was a good lawyer. But that entire situation was kind of like I would say it's like just a cameo for Jesse, right? It was just to get Jesse in the show, and it really, really made me laugh. I enjoyed it. I was sitting back, and my girl, actually, because I was watching this in bed, my girl watched Breaking Bad with me, and she's been watching bits and pieces of Better Call Saul. She wasn't invested entirely in the show. I was just watching it because we're in bed, right? And she likes to have her back rub, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to watch Better Call Saul. And then she's like, okay, you can watch TV if you give me a back rub. And I'm like, deal. So I'm rubbing her back. I'm watching my show. So she ended up, every single time we saw Walter Jesse, she was like looking at the TV. And I was like, it was so funny. So we both enjoyed the Jesse scene together, which was really cool. We then approach towards the end of the show because we're brought back to the present, right? And Jimmy actually reaches Kim while she's at work. Kim is then, hey, Jimmy, why are you calling me? How are you here? You need to turn yourself into the police, right? She gets kind of reminded about how guilty she is, and she actually takes a trip to go see Howard's wife. Opens up about absolutely everything. She comes clean and has that huge emotional breakdown on the bus, which again goes to show what a good actor Kim is, right? So Jimmy doesn't know this, and that's going to really bite him in the butt a little bit, right? So Marion's son ends up then getting himself in trouble because we're brought back to the scene where Jimmy's stuck in the guy's house that they drugged, and Marion's son ends up thinking that the police parked behind him, who were just having their lunch break, is following him. He boosts up, gets in real trouble because he crashes into a car. They figure out what he's doing. Gene gets away. He goes to Marion, and he wants help to get her son out. And he's like, okay, well, everything's going to be all good. Marion then ends up turning out to the laptop, and I should have known something was going to come from that laptop because I put a lot of attention to detail on that laptop they got Marion, right? She finds Better Call Saul, starts showing him. Jimmy tries to convince her that it's not him. Like, you think that's me? You think that's me? And then she's like, I typed in con man. You came up. Oh boy. I think she said con man in Albuquerque. So then Jimmy ends up having to go in hiding, running away, because Marion ended up calling the police on him, finding Saul Goodman. He ends up getting found. Gene ends up getting arrested. We have one more flashback in between this, and that are separate flashbacks between Saul being in the desert with Mike and when they were waiting at the vacuum repair place with Walt. And in both times, Jimmy is asking them about regrets, right? Or I can't remember who asked about regrets. I think it was Jimmy that asked about regrets. And Mike actually beat it into him a little bit where he's like, you just care about money? That's it? That's all? And Walt ended up looking at him and he's like, oh, so you've always been like this. And that really hammered it home for the kind of character that Jimmy and Kim have become, to be honest, because Jimmy he had a good heart, but he was completely corrupted, you know? That's why it's really tough. That's why it's really, really tough. So Gene ends up getting caught. He ends up getting arrested. He ends up negotiating down from, I believe it was 89 years to only 7 years. He claimed that he was a victim of Walter White. He later then, after a plane ride, he ends up wanting to trade more information. He ends up while he wanted to get Kim there, he wanted to get Kim in the crowd to make sure that she ended up being okay, and he took full responsibility for everything. In between this, though, before this, we actually see Marie. She's brought there because she's kind of involved in the case, right? With Hank and Steve Gomez. Saul ends up mentioning them. And you know what I was thinking too? Isn't it crazy that with everything that happened in Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, they ended up making Marie one of the most likable characters? How corrupted and how bad do all these characters have to be to make Marie a likable character? I see Marie in that scene. I'm not happy to see her. I just feel bad for her. I feel bad for everything that she's been through. And when Breaking Bad, season 1, 2, 3, even 4 maybe, she's just the worst. Nobody likes Marie. She's kind of a piece of crap, to be honest with you. Piece of crap friend, piece of crap wife, piece of crap sister. And everybody ends up being so bad that they make Marie likable. Regardless, it was nice to see Marie. I can't believe it was nice to see Marie, but it was. They're all in court together. Kim, Marie, everybody. Jimmy ends up admitting that he was completely in on Walter White's schemes. He ends up taking responsibility for Howard's death. He takes responsibility, for the murder of Chuck or Chuck's suicide, however you want to look at it. And he goes back to using the name Jimmy McGill. He admits to everything. He gives it up. No more scheming. He ends up getting the full 89 years or whatever it was. He's being transported to wherever the prison that he was staying in he negotiated for. I think he wanted some chocolate ice cream. There was some specific area where it was nice to stay. He negotiated to have that. He admitted to everything. While he's getting there, everybody recognizes him as Saul, so they all start cheering something like Better Call Saul or like, yay, Saul Goodman, something like that. And Jimmy ends up, for the last time, really enjoying being recognized in that sense. The end of the series breaks my heart. It really did. It was so sad. And it makes me wish that Kim actually died because, I don't know, I was feeling it so hard. Kim ended up visiting Jimmy to share a cigarette like they have the entire time in that same pose, but she leaves. Jimmy's in the basketball court, or wherever he is. He's behind bars. Jimmy's watching Kim leave, and Jimmy does the thing that Kim did to him when they were doing the scenes, where I can't do it exactly right, but he was looking at the guns like, poof, 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 right? Something along those lines. Kim looks at him, looks away, doesn't do it back, and Jimmy is left there alone in prison. I think that honestly broke my heart more than anything in the entire show. That is about the saddest way that you could end it. It was worse than seeing what happened to Jesse. It was worse than Walt at the end of Breaking Bad. That hit me harder than Hank. That hit me harder than anything in the entire show. How that ended. It's crazy how good this writing is and how much that really, really made me feel. I was so invested in that relationship. I wanted Kim to at least acknowledge him. And it never happened. And with that ends Better Call Saul and my journey with Breaking Bad. It was fantastic. I think I'm going to upload another video on like my thoughts of the entire series as a whole. But I was just sitting there after that show was done and I was like, wow. It was a fantastic show. It took me a couple months to get through it, but it was an absolutely fantastic show. Guys, with that being said, puts an end to my talk about Better Call Saul. Let me know what you thought about the entire thing down below. What you think about my thoughts? Did you think Kim was going to die? Because I really thought so. Like everything that I talked about, you can talk about whatever you want at this point. I am here to see spoilers now. Thank you so much for watching this video, everybody. On the screen right now, if you'd like to continue watching the Clenema channel, there'll be 2 videos on screen for you to check out right here. I will see you either there or in the next video, everybody. Take care.